The morning darkness over Saipan's northern landscape was pierced by the scratching sound of a pencil moving across moisture-dampened paper. It was 45 minutes past midnight on the 7th of July, 1944, and Corporal James Whelan, a Marine artillery observer positioned on the Tanapag Plain, was recording map coordinates that would prove instrumental in preserving thousands of American lives over the coming 15 hours. His notation read Grid 164-223, with an estimation of over 4,000 hostile forces advancing toward their position. His urgent message requested every battery within range to respond, emphasizing this was no mere probing action. What Whelan observed through his field glasses defied the logic of 20th century combat. Before him stretched an almost incomprehensible sight. Thousands upon thousands of Japanese troops assembling for a mass frontal assault in an age when such tactics had become obsolete thanks to automatic weaponry and sophisticated artillery coordination. The pre-dawn gloom revealed fixed bayonets catching what little light existed, officers brandishing ceremonial swords high above their heads, and behind these front ranks came the walking wounded, their heads wrapped in bandages, some even being carried on improvised stretchers, yet all moving inexorably forward in what history would record as the Pacific Theater's most massive Banzai assault. 23 miles worth of American artillery pieces swiveled toward the designated grid coordinates. The arsenal included 105mm howitzers, 155mm long tom cannons, 81mm mortars, and the massive naval guns mounted on warships stationed just offshore. The Japanese commanders remained unaware they were advancing directly into the most advanced fire control apparatus ever assembled for battle. This was a system capable of delivering more explosive destruction onto a single map coordinate in 60 seconds than entire armies possessed during the previous World War. The principles of modern combat were about to be demonstrated in a language the Imperial Japanese military had consistently refused to comprehend. The precision involved in manually configured time-on-target fire missions, combined with centralized fire direction centers that could orchestrate lethal barrages from dozens of separate batteries with the ease of a conductor leading an orchestra, represented warfare transformed into calculated science. Japanese military philosophy regarding gyokusai, the concept of shattering like precious jewels, had transformed from a tactical approach into strategic self-delusion by the middle of 1944. What originated as shock assault methods employed in China against inadequately equipped opposition had hardened into something approaching religious conviction when faced with an adversary that had industrialized combat beyond Japanese understanding. The initial indicators of this fundamental disconnect appeared at Guadalcanal during August of 1942. The Ichiki detachment, consisting of 917 soldiers from the 28th Infantry Regiment, launched an attack against Marine positions along what the Americans had designated Alligator Creek. The Marines, with support from pre-registered artillery belonging to the 11th Marines Regiment, eliminated over 800 Japanese troops in a single nighttime engagement. The handful of survivors brought back unprecedented reports of American artillery shells arriving simultaneously from multiple directions, creating an impenetrable barrier of steel fragmentation that no amount of personal bravery could overcome. By the time of the Tarawa engagement in November of 43, American forces had refined their methodologies considerably. Fire Direction Centers, commonly abbreviated as FDCS, now employed enhanced radio communication systems and standardized operational procedures, enabling them to concentrate fire from multiple battalions in under 2 minutes. The Japanese assault tactics that had succeeded through psychological impact when employed in China were being systematically annihilated by mathematical precision. The disparity separating American and Japanese artillery doctrine represented far more than simple technological differences. This was a vast chasm dividing industrial capacity from warrior mythologies. While Japanese artillery continued relying on direct visual observation and individual battery operations, the Americans had constructed an integrated network that would have seemed like pure science fiction to military strategists merely 10 years earlier. The American Fire Direction Center, perfected by 1944, represented a remarkable achievement in applied mathematics. Artillery officers utilized graphical firing tables, slide rules, and plotting boards to compute firing solutions, accounting for air temperature fluctuations, wind velocity, barrel wear deterioration, powder temperature variations, and even the planet's rotation. A properly trained FDC crew could calculate complete fire missions for multiple batteries in under 60 seconds. Major David Little, who commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines on Saipan, documented the system in official reports, explaining how forward observers accompanied every infantry company, connected through radio and wire communications to the central FDC. When these observers requested fire support, the target location was plotted on firing charts. Calculation data was generated for each battery based on their specific positions, and firing commands were transmitted. Within 90 seconds of receiving the initial call, rounds were already traveling through the air from numerous batteries, all timed to strike simultaneously. The Japanese possessed nothing remotely comparable to this system. Their artillery doctrine, based on French methodologies from the previous World War, emphasized direct fire techniques and independent battery action. Communications depended on human runners and signal flags. Their forward observers, in the rare instances where such positions existed, operated without radio equipment. A Japanese artillery battery might require 15 minutes to engage a target that American gunners could strike within 90 seconds. By the 6th of July in 1944, the Japanese situation on Saipan had become utterly hopeless. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito's forces had been compressed into a pocket in the island's northern region, squeezed into an area barely 3 miles in width. Of the initial 32,000 Japanese soldiers and naval personnel stationed on the island, fewer than 5,000 remained combat-capable. American forces, comprising the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, along with the 27th Infantry Division, had them surrounded on 3 sides with the Pacific Ocean blocking any retreat. In his final written order, later recovered from his deceased body after the battle concluded, General Saito composed these words. Whether they chose to attack or remain in their current positions, death was the only certainty. However, within death existed life. They must utilize this opportunity to demonstrate authentic Japanese manhood. He would advance with whoever remained capable of delivering another blow against the American forces. The Japanese dedicated the 6th of July to preparing for Gyokusai. Every soldier, sailor, and marine capable of bearing arms was organized into assault formations. The wounded who could still walk were positioned in follow-up waves. Japanese civilians, including women and teenagers, received bamboo spears and instructions to follow behind the military units. Those too severely injured to walk received grenades with orders to wait for American troops to pass their positions before detonating themselves. The Americans sensed something significant was approaching. Intelligence officer Major James Cogswell had intercepted fragmentary Japanese communications suggesting a final assault was imminent. More tellingly, Japanese artillery had fallen completely silent, indicating they were conserving ammunition for a concluding barrage. Forward observers noted unusual movement patterns within Japanese lines after darkness fell. What the Japanese forces didn't comprehend as they assembled in the darkness was that they were marching directly into the most sophisticated killing apparatus ever conceived by military planners. The American artillery positioned on Saipan represented overwhelming firepower organized with scientific precision. The available artillery included 4 Marine artillery battalions equipped with 105mm howitzers totaling 48 guns, 2 Marine artillery battalions with 155mm howitzers totaling 24 guns, 3 Army artillery battalions with 155mm howitzers totaling 36 guns, 1 Army artillery battalion with 155mm guns totaling 12 pieces, dozens of 81mm mortars organic to infantry battalions, naval gunfire support from 6 battleships and 8 cruisers positioned offshore. The total exceeded 150 artillery tubes, not counting mortars and naval guns. These batteries were interconnected through redundant communication systems, including primary radio networks, backup wire lines, and emergency runner protocols. Every infantry battalion had trained forward observers. Every battery had surveyed its position to within inches of accuracy. Every gun had registered on pre-planned target coordinates. The entire system could concentrate fire on a single target or simultaneously engage multiple targets across the battlefield. Colonel Louis Metzger, commanding the 10th Marine Artillery Regiment, had invested 3 weeks perfecting the fire plan. His operations officer, Major Thomas Warnham, had divided the island into numbered squares on a master grid map. Each battery had pre-calculated firing data for every square within their designated sector. When a forward observer called for fire on grid 164-223, every battery already possessed the necessary range and deflection calculations. At precisely 4:45 in the morning on July 7, 1944, approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers and armed civilians began their advance. The National World War II Museum's comprehensive account, derived from official Marine Corps documentation, confirms this as the largest Banzai charge throughout the entire Pacific War. The leading elements included remnants of the 136th Infantry Regiment from the 43rd Division, naval personnel from the destroyed Saipan Naval Base, and aviation ground crews. The wounded hobbled forward on crutches, determined to die with honor intact. The Japanese moved through the Tanapag Plain Valley toward a 500-yard gap separating the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. As they advanced, they began their battle cries, shouting Banzai repeatedly. The sound of thousands of voices echoing off the valley walls created an otherworldly auditory effect that chilled even the most experienced Marines. Corporal Whelan, concealed in his observation post on a ridge overlooking the valley, was already communicating via radio, calling in a fire mission on grid 164-223, reporting enemy infantry in open terrain, estimated regiment strength moving southward, requesting immediate suppression. The response came within seconds from the 10th Marines Fire Direction Center, acknowledging the grid coordinates and confirming time on target for all available batteries with splash expected in 90 seconds. What transpired next was the culmination of 2 years of American refinement in the art of coordinated fires. Within the Fire Direction Center, a choreographed sequence of calculations commenced. The target grid was plotted on the master chart. Distance and direction measurements from each battery were taken with precision instruments. Corrections for prevailing weather conditions were applied. Time on target missions represented the pinnacle of artillery coordination. Rather than batteries firing when ready, creating a rolling barrage that afforded enemies time to seek cover, every battery calculated when to fire so their shells would arrive at precisely the same moment. Batteries located farther from the target fired first, those positioned closer fired later. The result was that dozens or even hundreds of shells would suddenly materialize from the sky simultaneously, providing absolutely no warning. At exactly 4:47, the sky above the advancing Japanese forces erupted. The official Marine Corps Historical Records document that the initial barrage included shells from 12 artillery battalions plus naval gunfire support. The effect on the densely concentrated Japanese formation was catastrophic. Survivors continued their advance despite impossible odds, picking their way through the bodies of fallen comrades, still screaming their battle cries. Corporal Whelan continued calling in adjustments, requesting drops and lateral shifts, reporting enemy infantry continuing their advance and requesting repeat barrages. What distinguished American artillery in '44 from all previous conflicts was the capability to maintain continuous adjusted fire while enemy forces remained in motion. Forward observers didn't simply call in a barrage and hope for results. They observed the fall of shot, called in corrections, and walked the fire through enemy formations systematically. The fire direction centers had developed a technique called ladder fire, designed specifically for countering Banzai charges. As the Japanese advanced, the artillery would fire a line of shells across their front, then methodically walk the barrage backward through their ranks, then forward again, then backward, functioning like a giant scythe cutting wheat. By 5:30 in the morning, the main Japanese charge had advanced merely 400 yards at devastating cost. Bodies carpeted the valley floor. The wounded crawled over the dead, still attempting to advance. Some groups sought cover in ravines and defiles, only to have forward observers call in airbursts that transformed these positions into death traps. As devastating as the artillery proved, some Japanese soldiers inevitably pushed through the barrage. By 6 in the morning, scattered groups had reached the main defensive line. The 105th Infantry Regiment bore the brunt of the assault. The two forward battalions would suffer 406 killed and 512 wounded, nearly 80% casualties according to National World War II Museum records. This was where the American integration of direct and indirect fire support demonstrated its full potential. Every Marine rifle company had 60mm mortars organic to its weapons platoon. Every battalion had 81mm mortars. These could engage targets too close for artillery, within the danger close range where friendly fire became a significant risk. At 6:15, the largest remaining group of Japanese soldiers, approximately 600 men, penetrated the American line and overran artillery positions of the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines. The artillery crews removed firing locks from their howitzers and fought as infantry. Some batteries depressed their gun barrels and fired point-blank into the charging Japanese, using ricochet fire to bounce shells off the ground. As the battle raged, the Navy added its weight to the slaughter. The battleship Tennessee and the cruiser Louisville had been stationed offshore specifically to support the defense against night attacks. Their 14-inch and 8-inch guns could fire star shells for illumination and high-explosive rounds for destruction. Fire control parties ashore could communicate directly with naval gunfire liaisons aboard the ships. When Japanese reserves were spotted forming for a second wave, the call went out requesting naval gunfire on designated grid coordinates with troops in open terrain. Official naval records show that Tennessee alone fired 293 rounds of 14-inch ammunition during the engagement, while Louisville contributed 322 rounds of 8-inch shells. By 7:30 in the morning, the Banzai charge had degenerated into isolated groups of Japanese soldiers trying to find any way through the American lines. The carefully planned human wave attack had been shattered by coordinated firepower. Small groups of 5 to 20 soldiers would periodically emerge from cover, scream their battle cries, and charge the nearest American position. The American artillery had shifted to harassing and interdiction fire, random barrages on likely assembly areas and routes of movement to prevent the Japanese from reorganizing. Every few minutes, a valley or ravine would erupt in explosions as artillery denied the enemy any safe ground. The most tragic phase began around 900 hours, when Japanese wounded who couldn't walk began their own desperate actions. According to multiple eyewitness accounts documented in official histories, men with one leg hopped forward on crutches while holding grenades. Soldiers with severe wounds crawled toward American lines, pushing rifles ahead of them. The chaos of the Banzai charge produced 3 Medal of Honor recipients whose actions are thoroughly documented in official citations. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 105th Infantry, refused evacuation despite his wounds. When Japanese forces overran his command post, he mounted a jeep-mounted 50-caliber machine gun and directed fire against the enemy. After expending all ammunition, he fought with 2 pistols until killed. His body was found surrounded by at least 30 dead Japanese soldiers. Private Thomas Baker from Company A of the 105th Infantry destroyed a Japanese strongpoint with a bazooka, then fought off multiple attacks, personally killing at least 24 enemy soldiers. Severely wounded and unable to walk, he refused evacuation, telling his comrades to get away from him. When his position was recaptured, Baker was found dead, propped against a tree with an empty .45 pistol in his hand and 8 dead Japanese soldiers around him. Captain Benjamin Salomon, serving as battalion surgeon for the 2nd Battalion of the 105th Infantry, was treating wounded when Japanese soldiers entered his aid station. He killed 4 with his rifle, then ordered the wounded evacuated while he covered their withdrawal with a machine gun. His body was found slumped over the weapon with 98 dead Japanese soldiers in front of his position. He had suffered 76 bullet wounds and 24 bayonet wounds. As full daylight came to Saipan at 1000 hours, the full extent of the slaughter became visible. Official body count teams would eventually document 43,011 Japanese dead from the charge. American casualties totaled approximately 1,000 killed and wounded, with the 105th Infantry Regiment essentially destroyed as a fighting unit. The mathematics were stark. The American artillery had fired approximately 12,000 rounds during the 15-hour battle. The fire direction centres had coordinated fires from 18 separate artillery battalions plus naval gunfire support. The system had functioned exactly as designed. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Walt, observing the aftermath, wrote in his official report that the enemy had attacked with great courage but without modern tactical sense, and that the fire support system functioned exactly as designed, with forward observers performing magnificently and fire direction centres never missing a beat. As the sun climbed higher, American graves registration teams began the grim work of collecting bodies. The scale of death was unprecedented in the Pacific War. Major Edward McCarthy, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 105th Infantry, one of the units that bore the brunt of the attack, described it in his after-action report as looking like a cattle stampede from a Western movie, except the Japanese just kept on coming. Among the American lines, the psychological impact was profound. Many Marines and soldiers had witnessed death before, but nothing on this scale. The systematic destruction of thousands of human beings, no matter how necessary, left deep impressions. Captain Edmund Love, the 27th Division historian who would later write extensively about the battle, interviewed survivors immediately after the action. His notes, preserved in the National Archives, capture the raw emotions, describing how men who had been through everything were shaken, not by fear since the Japanese never really had a chance, but by the sheer scale of the killing. The Japanese survivors melted back into caves in northern Saipan. Among them was Captain Sakai Oba, who would lead guerrilla resistance for another 16 months before finally surrendering in December 1945, 3 months after Japan's capitulation. General Saito, who had ordered the charge, committed ritual suicide on July 10, 1944, 3 days after the failed assault. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, former commander of the Pearl Harbor attack force, had already taken his own life on July 6th, the day before the charge. Their deaths marked the end of Japanese organized resistance on Saipan. The Battle of Saipan's Banzai charge showcased revolutionary developments in military technology and doctrine. The Fire Direction Center system, developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s, had transformed artillery from an art to a science. Instead of individual battery commanders making gut decisions, trained specialists used mathematical procedures to optimize every aspect of fire support. The system included graphical firing tables that eliminated complex calculations, standard radio procedures that minimized communication time, and pre-surveyed battery positions accurate to within 1 meter. Meteorological sections provided hourly weather updates, while registration procedures accounted for barrel wear and ammunition variations. Time-on-target missions, a uniquely American capability at the time, demonstrated the pinnacle of this coordination. Multiple batteries would calculate backward from a desired impact time, with guns firing in sequence so all shells arrived simultaneously. This technique, impossible without precise communication and calculation, multiplied the psychological and physical impact of artillery fire. Japanese military leadership had received warnings about American artillery capabilities, but chose to ignore them. Japanese officers who had observed operations in Europe had reported on American fire support doctrine. Attachés in neutral countries had reported on American industrial production of artillery ammunition, millions of rounds per month. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, operations officer for the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, had studied American tactics and warned against Banzai charges. In pre-war planning sessions, he had argued that massed infantry attacks against modern firepower were suicidal. He was overruled by generals who believed spiritual power could overcome material disadvantage. The Banzai charges revealed fatal flaws in Japanese racial ideology. The belief that Americans were soft, materialistic, and incapable of sustained combat had been drummed into every Japanese soldier. They were told that Americans would break and run when faced with determined Japanese warriors exhibiting the Japanese spirit. This racism cut both ways. American forces, initially terrified by Banzai charges in early battles, had by 44 come to see them as evidence of Japanese irrationality. The charges reinforced American stereotypes that would influence strategic decisions, including the use of atomic weapons a year later. The American response to Banzai charges, overwhelming firepower rather than countercharges, reflected both tactical wisdom and cultural differences. Americans approached war as a problem to be solved through technology and organization. Japanese approached it as a test of spiritual strength. When these philosophies collided, technology always won. The Saipan Banzai charge represented the culmination of 2 years of American learning and adaptation. In early 1942, American forces had been caught off guard by Japanese tactics. By mid-44, they had developed specific counter-doctrines that turned Japanese strengths into weaknesses. The evolution was documented in after-action reports from various Pacific battles. At Guadalcanal in August 42, enemy night attacks achieved initial success through surprise and aggression, with recommendations for improved night defensive procedures. At New Georgia in July 43, coordinated defensive fires broke up most enemy charges, with units having registered artillery support suffering minimal casualties. At Tarawa in November 43, time-on-target missions proved highly effective against massed enemy troops, with recommendations that all forward observers be trained in these procedures. At Saipan in July 44, the enemy Banzai attack was completely destroyed by coordinated fires with no changes to doctrine recommended. American troops, who had initially been unnerved by screaming Japanese soldiers charging with bayonets, had learned to see these attacks as opportunities for destruction rather than threats. The decision to launch the Banzai charge on Saipan represented a catastrophic failure of Japanese military leadership. General Saito knew the attack would fail. His final messages indicated he saw it as a death ritual rather than a military operation with achievable objectives. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commanding general of the 5th Amphibious Corps, analysed the Japanese decision in his memoir, noting that from a military standpoint, the Banzai charge was insane. The Japanese had strong defensive positions in northern Saipan's caves and ravines. They could have conducted a fighting withdrawal that would have cost Americans thousands of casualties and bought time for their homeland defences. Instead, they came out in the open where American firepower advantage was absolute. The Japanese military's inability to adapt to modern firepower stemmed from institutional and cultural factors that prioritized spiritual values over material reality. Officers who suggested defensive tactics or fighting withdrawals were labeled cowards. The result was tactical suicide on a massive scale. The American artillery system that destroyed the Saipan Banzai charge incorporated multiple technological innovations. Radio communications using various FM radios provided clear, static-free communications even in the electromagnetic chaos of battle, with ranges of 3 to 5 miles, allowing observers to communicate with multiple fire direction centers simultaneously. American artillery units used the latest survey equipment to establish battery positions with unprecedented accuracy. Battery positions were tied into a common grid system that allowed any observer to call for fire from any battery without complex calculations. Each artillery regiment had a meteorological section that released weather balloons every 6 hours to measure wind speed and direction at various altitudes. This data was crucial for long-range fire accuracy. Fire control instruments allowed fire direction centers to track multiple targets and friendly units simultaneously, solving complex firing problems in seconds rather than minutes. The destruction of the Saipan Banzai charge had strategic implications beyond the island itself. When word reached Tokyo that over 4,000 soldiers had died in a single charge with minimal American casualties, it contributed to the fall of Prime Minister Tojo's government on July 18, 1944. The fall of Saipan brought American bombers within 1,250 miles of Tokyo. By November 1944, bombers were launching from Saipan's rebuilt airfields to strike the Japanese homeland. A Japanese admiral would later state that their war was lost with the loss of Saipan. Despite the obvious futility demonstrated at Saipan, Japanese forces would launch more Banzai charges at subsequent battles, including Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, each ending in similar slaughter. The refusal to adapt would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. 9 months after Saipan at Okinawa in May 1945, the final evolution of American counter-Banzai tactics was displayed. When the Japanese 32nd Army launched desperate charges on May 4th, the results were even more devastating than Saipan. The May 4th counter-offensive saw 5,000 Japanese soldiers attack American lines. Within 6 hours, 4,500 were dead. The Americans suffered 335 casualties. The kill ratio of nearly 15-1 demonstrated the absolute dominance of coordinated firepower over human wave attacks. By Okinawa, the Americans had added new elements, including improved white phosphorus shells for marking and psychological effects, better integration between Marine and Army artillery units, and continuous wave radar for tracking enemy movement at night. The efficiency of American artillery in destroying Banzai charges raised profound questions about the nature of modern warfare. The industrial slaughter of brave but misguided soldiers, while militarily necessary, troubled many American participants. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, whose battalion helped repel the charge, wrote in his personal papers that there was no glory in what they did. They killed thousands of brave men who never had a chance. Yes, they were trying to kill Americans. Yes, it was necessary. But turning artillery into an assembly line of death was not war as their fathers knew it. The one-sided nature of the killing, made possible by American technological and organizational superiority, represented a new kind of warfare where courage alone meant nothing against coordinated firepower. The artillery techniques perfected against Japanese Banzai charges would influence military doctrine for decades. The fire direction center concept became standard in all modern armies. Time-on-target missions became routine training. The integration of forward observers with infantry units became doctrine. In Korea 5 years later, American forces would use identical techniques to destroy Chinese human wave attacks. At various Korean war battles, artillery destroyed entire Chinese divisions attempting night assaults. The Chinese, like the Japanese before them, learned that courage could not overcome coordinated firepower. The Vietnam conflict saw further refinement with computers for fire control calculations and helicopter-borne forward observers. The Gulf War in 1991 showcased GPS-guided artillery shells. But the basic concept of massed coordinated fires directed by forward observers remained unchanged from Saipan. Decades after the battle, American veterans of Saipan reflected on their experience. At the 50th anniversary commemoration in 1994, survivors gathered to remember that terrible morning. Arthur Robinson, a private with the 105th Infantry who survived the charge, recalled that people had to understand they didn't want to kill them all. But the enemy kept coming in wave after wave, and American artillery just cut them down. It was horrible. But what choice did they have? The efficiency of the killing haunted many participants. They had won not through superior courage or skill, but through superior systems and firepower. It was victory without glory, success without satisfaction. The destruction of the Japanese Banzai charge on Saipan demonstrated how modern warfare with massed artillery, coordinated fire control, and integrated communications represented the application of industrial management techniques to warfare. The Japanese Banzai charge, rooted in samurai tradition and beliefs about honorable death, belonged to an earlier era. Against American artillery in '44, it was mass suicide disguised as military tactics. The Saipan Banzai charge taught crucial lessons that only one side survived to apply. For the Americans, it validated their investment in artillery and fire control systems. The ability to mass fires from multiple batteries on a single target within seconds had proven decisive. For Japan, the lesson came too late. Some Japanese officers did learn and adapt. On Iwo Jima and later at Okinawa, certain generals avoided large-scale Banzai charges, instead fighting defensive battles that maximized American casualties. But these were exceptions. The institutional Japanese military never formally abandoned the Banzai charge. Captain Sakai Oba, who survived by avoiding the main charge and conducting guerrilla operations, would later reflect that they learned that night that courage without technology is meaningless in modern war. The Americans didn't defeat their spirit, they simply made it irrelevant. The final accounting of the Saipan Banzai charge reveals the stark mathematics of industrial warfare. Japanese casualties included 43,011 confirmed killed in action. Wounded numbers were unknown, as most died subsequently. Total participants numbered approximately 4,000 to 4,300. The casualty rate approached 100%. American casualties in the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry included 406 killed and 512 wounded. The 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines suffered 127 casualties. Total American casualties approximated 1,000. The casualty rate for engaged units was 40%. Ammunition expended included an estimated 12,000-plus artillery rounds, thousands of mortar rounds, and 615 major-caliber naval gunfire shells documented. Cost-effectiveness worked out to approximately 3 artillery shells per Japanese casualty. These numbers tell a story of industrial efficiency applied to human destruction. The Americans had turned warfare into an equation where firepower multiplied by coordination equaled victory. The Saipan Banzai charge raises questions that remain relevant to modern warfare. Is there a place for human courage in industrialized combat? Can technology completely negate the human element in war? Does the efficiency of killing diminish the humanity of those who conduct it? Modern American military doctrine, shaped by experiences like Saipan, emphasizes overwhelming firepower and technological superiority. The goal is to win with minimal friendly casualties, even if that means massive enemy casualties. This approach has proven effective but raises moral questions about the nature of warfare. The destruction of the Japanese Banzai charge on Saipan marked the definitive end of an era in warfare. Never again would military forces launch massed infantry charges against modern firepower expecting anything but annihilation. The romance of the charge, whether cavalry with sabres or infantry with bayonets, died on Tanapag Plain under American artillery fire. What emerged from the smoke and carnage was a new understanding of warfare as an industrial process. Victory would go not to the bravest, but to those with the best systems, whether fire control systems, communication systems, or logistical systems. The human element remained important but subordinate to technological and organizational superiority. The Japanese soldiers who charged into American artillery on July 7, 1944, were among the last to believe that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. Their deaths proved conclusively that in modern warfare, courage without technology is not enough. The American artillery system that destroyed them represented the future of warfare, coordinated, calculated, crushingly efficient. The 43,011 Japanese soldiers who died in the charge showed extraordinary courage. They deserved better than to be fed into the mechanical jaws of American artillery. But their commanders, blinded by ideology and tradition, sent them to die in a manner that achieved nothing except to demonstrate the obsolescence of their tactical doctrine. Their sacrifice stands as an eternal warning that in modern warfare, courage alone is not enough. Technology, organization, and firepower will always defeat human waves, no matter how brave those humans might be. The age of the glorious charge ended on Saipan, killed by American artillery that turned warfare into mathematics and mathematics into mass death. The Banzai charge was obliterated by American artillery coordination, but more importantly, the very idea of the Banzai charge was obliterated, revealed as a romantic anachronism in an age of industrial warfare. In the Valley of Death on Saipan, courage met coordination, spirit met system, tradition met technology, and technology won because it always does.